Hey, if you'd like to earn CEUs for this webinar, join the Saphopedia community at the link in the description below. Now, on to the show.
Thanks for the invitation. As I shared in my earlier comments, I'm honored to be able to have an opportunity to be at the foundation of this community that's being built. And the topic that I'm going to share today is, it influences the way I see the community. And it's important to me that I hang out in spaces that are aware of the importance of psychological safety and of openness and being inviting and just a community where people feel like they're a part. And one of the challenges to forming community, I believe, is the existence of psychosocial hazards, and people just don't know they're there. So if you got 6 or 8 people together in a room and they could see that the air wasn't clean, you wouldn't have to tell people, the air not clean being there's smoke in the air. You wouldn't have to tell people about leaving. They tend to leave kind of on their own. They'd start coughing and hacking, and they try to go to where there's better air. Well, interestingly, because we've normalized psychosocial hazards, they're in the environment and something doesn't feel right, but we really don't know what it is. So that's really the discussion I'd like to have today. Before I do that, though, I simply must mention that part of the reason I'm in the safety community today is because of the time that I spent in the fire rescue service. And I do what I do from a safety perspective in remembrance of these people, these 30 people I worked with at some point. Some I knew better than others. Some was only a couple of times we worked together, but all of them lost their lives either getting killed at work or dying from something that they were exposed to at work. And any and everything that I do from a safety perspective is with them in mind to make sure that there aren't other names added to that list. So let's talk a little bit about, and I had opportunity yesterday to stop in on a couple of the sessions that talked about psychological safety. And again, they did a great job of talking about it. And I really don't want to rehash what was said, but just to take a different slant on it. So first of all, again, there's a lot of conversation in business and organizations and all kinds of places about the importance of engagement. We've got to engage our employees. That hour thing. I'll talk about that here in a second. We have to engage people. We want to make sure that they're involved. But how are people possibly going to engage in something when they can't bring their whole self to it or their real self to it? So Dr. William Kahn, who's a professor at Boston University back in the 90s, suggested that this conversation about engagement is interesting, but people have to be able to bring their full self to it. You can't expect people to engage in something when they can just, you ask for their arm or for their leg or for how they feel about a particular thing, but the rest of that stuff, we're not interested in it. And he suggested that engagement actually occurs on 3 levels or 3 dimensions. He talked about it. He said the first is physical. That's physical engagement. My body's here today. I know none of you on this listening to this session know anything about what that's like. But for me, I have had situations where my body was there, but my mind was someplace else. My heart was really someplace else, but I actually showed up. The second dimension is emotional engagement, where I'm there, my body is there, and I even know why I'm there. I know what the rules are. I know what I'm expected to do. I kind of even know why the organization is there. And that's kind of where it stops. It's a little bit more transactional, and that's actually okay because I'm in the room. But then there is ultimately the dimension of emotional engagement. Not only am I there and do I know why I'm there, I have an emotional connection to what's going on. I heard once that people don't shoot holes in a boat that they're actually in. So if you're wondering why people are complaining and saying this is terrible and, we ought to do this different, it's generally because they're not really a part of it anyway. They're not really emotionally connected to it. It's easier to throw rocks at things that you're not emotionally connected to. Dr. Amy Edmondson is given credit for popularizing the concept of psychological safety. her book, The Fearless Organization, her presentations, or a scholarship at Harvard University. Oh, she's done a marvelous job of familiarizing us with this concept. It is in session. It is a fad to talk about psychological safety now. And again, that's the belief that, if we're in a group, that we can have a different idea and suggest something that people hadn't suggested before, and not get humiliated or talked about or spoken badly about relative to our new idea. So just another, person some of you probably heard of, and Gabe brought him up earlier. I want you to hear what Simon has to say.
Speaking fire.
Oh, we're not hearing the volume, David.
One of the reasons that happens is not because we're necessarily speaking truth to power, it's the manner in which we do it. We usually do it as a complaint.
So it sounds like you're not hearing the volume. So
you can, if you want to unshare, and then when you share again, you got to hit the share sound.
We don't know what their story is.
Okay.
You stop sharing, and then you go to share again. At the very bottom of the share screen will be a little checkbox. Yeah,
I think what I'll do is I'll move to the next slide, because he's not ready. Yeah, sorry about that, folks. But what Simon talks about in that little clip, he talks about the fact that you can be in an environment where you really don't have the opportunity to be able to share with the leadership or with the organization itself. It's a difficult thing to do because it's not safe to do it. It really isn't. And I'm sure many of us have been in those scenarios before where we wanted to share, or we wanted to have a contribution, but we just weren't able to do it because that wasn't the environment. And so, and that's a really important distinction when we talk about psychological safety. Dr. Timothy Clark picked up on this concept of psychological safety in 2020 and suggested that there are actually stages of psychological safety. So, and it starts with being included. It's difficult for me to know that it's psychologically safe when I'm not really included in that. I don't really know what it is you're talking about. And I'm not suggesting it's good or bad, but I'm not included in the conversation. So it's hard to be safe in that environment. It's also, sometimes you can be included, but not necessarily be getting anything out of it. So what did I learn about being in that group? What did I get out of the gathering that I was invited to? And often it's because it really wasn't set up for me. It's a little bit over my head, or it's, it's in a language I don't understand. I'm in the room. Someone can check the box and say I was included, but I didn't really get as much out of it because I didn't learn as much. Even greater than that is, can I actually contribute? So it's great to be able to be in the room and learn from you, but will you be interested in learning anything from me? Will I be able to contribute to the conversation? Will I be able to put my ideas, my thoughts, my views on the table? And even more important is, can I challenge what's going on? That's important, to be able to challenge, because sometimes the system is not necessarily set up such that it's going to be good for me. It was good for you, but it may not be good for me. Knowing the challenges that we have with the video, I want to go to talk a little bit about a situation that if there are folks, and I understand if there are people who are involved in the fire rescue service who are at the conference, and January 5th, 1995, in the city of Seattle, there was a fire that occurred. And this fire occurred at a small frozen food warehouse on the corner of 8th and Dearborn. Again, I know it well because, again, I spent 20 years in the Seattle Fire Department. At the time, was a acting battalion chief, wasn't working this particular day. And so a call comes in at about 7 in the evening, and a bunch of Seattle Fire Department personnel respond. And one of the companies that responded was Engine 13. So Engine 13 shows up on the one side of this building and is getting ready to make entry to fight this fire. And one of the firefighters looks down and sees that there is smoke coming up between the sidewalk and the poured concrete floor. This is interesting because that suggests, I mean, even people that don't know anything about fire might know that that suggests that there's something going on below you that you might want to pay attention to. And the firefighter actually knew that. But and again, this is from his statement that I heard. He said, I didn't say anything because my officer was not the kind of officer that would take that kind of feedback anyway. And that in and of itself is not a criticism of the officer either, because that's the way we taught our officers to do business, just like a lot of other folks did. Is you're in charge, you're the leader, you have to know, and particularly at an emergency, there's no time to have discussions. And there are some that actually still believe that today. So these firefighters all make entry into this building along with some other folks. And they weren't in this building for more than a few moments, and the floor started to collapse. As a matter of fact, another eyewitness told me that he felt the floor drop and someone said, get out, get out, get out. And so there are a number of people in the room, and those first two people from Engine 13 were actually able to dive out a window to get to the, because there's another portion of the building a little bit lower, to save themselves. Unfortunately, there was a collapse. There was a massive effort to try to rescue the firefighters that were trapped at the time, and those efforts were unsuccessful. That 2 firefighters from Engine 13, one from Ladder 7 and one from Engine 10 lost their life. And they are actually on that tombstone that I showed you earlier. Lieutenant Gregory Shoemaker, Lieutenant Walter Kilgore, firefighter Randy Terlicker, and firefighter James Brown. These 4 firefighters. Now, again, that information may not have saved their lives, but it may have. It is difficult to say when there are fatalities if any particular thing would have made a difference, but what might have happened had that information been able to have been shared. And again, it was information that probably no one in a similar situation would have shared, because that wasn't the culture at the time. So let's talk a little bit about how psychosocial hazards impact the concept of psychological safety. A lot of the conversation that we hear around psychological safety is that we have to create this environment where people feel safe and they want to bring their whole self. And in order to do that, we need to have things to make sure that they're resilient, and to make sure that, we've got, stress reduction types of things, and that we got yoga and fruit bowls and all kinds of things going on. So after they're traumatized, they can deal with what they've been exposed to. I prefer to back all the way up and let's talk about the hazard itself. So in 2021, I had opportunity to do some qualitative research around exposure to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. And my observation is that we often expose people to hazards that we're not aware of. Wasn't really intentional, but these hazards tend to make it difficult for people to be their whole self and to bring their whole self. And it's a very interesting situation that we've not talked a lot about in the United States, but a number of countries around the world actually have. So let's go back to a little bit of rudimentary conversation for safety professionals. So what's a hazard? Well, of course, a hazard is really anything that can potentially harm you. Anything that can potentially harm you. And again, when we're talking about the standard 5 hazards, so these are the hazards that are embedded in Occupational Safety and Health Act. So when the act was passed back in 1970, the goal was to try to mitigate or address these 5 hazards: biological, ergonomic, chemical, physical, and safety hazards. And the OSH Act, again, because we're kind of a compliance-driven system, has done a tremendous job of addressing these 5 hazards. It is hard to argue that it has not been very successful in this regard. However, there's a hazard that kind of got left out of the conversation. As a matter of fact, as I said, when the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed, it had roughly 19,600 words, and it mentioned psychological twice. So the act was really not set up, a bit of a sidebar here. It also said his employment, his employer, and that's probably because only 2% of the people in the room did not identify as male. So again, it was how the act was written and the people who wrote it, again, not criticizing their work because they did a great job in getting this act passed. It'd been hundreds of years of, workers dying on the job and nobody seeming to care. And that the act actually did a really good job of helping us start to care about that. And again, some people care about it kind of because they have to. But unfortunately, the concept of psychosocial was not in the discussion. And what is psychosocial? It is about two things: psychology, your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, how you feel, and social, how you interact with other people, culture, the environment. And the combination of those two things, how I think, how I feel, and how I act, actually can influence the safety environment, and it can ultimately influence the physical environment as well. So if I really wanted you to zero in on one thing, it would be this definition in my research is a little bit different from many of the other definitions of this term. As a matter of fact, I found close to a dozen different definitions of what a psychosocial hazard is. And the way I looked at it, they looked to me more like examples of what a hazard was, but not really what is it. It wasn't really a definition, at least to me. And when you're doing doctoral research, you get to come up with your own ideas, basing them on others, of course. And so my thought is that a psychosocial hazard is a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced as a threat to the person exposed. And that perception or experience actually influences the way that they behave. I think that's really important. That perception or experience is really, really important. And so when I talk to more traditional safety professionals, they get a little nervous when I get to this part, but this is a very, very unique way to look at a hazard, that it depends on the person. So it might be a hazard to one person and not be a hazard to another. A chemical hazard. So when I was a member of the hazardous materials team in Seattle, it was pretty clear once we found 3 different sources to identify the chemicals, pretty clear what to do, because the chemical does what the chemical does. It's not one way for one person and one way for another. If you inhale this and you're human, you're not going to continue to breathe because it's something that will interfere with the ability of your body to turn oxygen, to get oxygen into your bloodstream because of the chemical. And it doesn't matter who you are. Psychosocial hazards are simply different. And it really has to do with how our brain is put together. So our brain is this very interesting supercomputer that looks at the world in binary kinds of ways. It's a zero-sum game for the brain. It is either a threat or a reward, period. So when you get those 11 million bits of information that your brain can process almost instantaneously, it's trying to determine, is this a threat or is this a reward? And the brain does a better job of figuring out threats than it does rewards because it figures out the threats early. The amygdala fires up and says, hey, we have to protect ourselves. And we have to work our way through that to decide, oh, well, maybe this is actually a reward. In terms of how we make that determination, Dr. David Rock suggests in his work in 2008 that there's this, what he calls the SCARF method. And he looks at how the brain is interpreting these stimuli in our environment. And so what the brain looks at is threat or reward based on status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So if my status is affected, so if you tell me I'm not good at that, that's a threat to my status. If you pat me on the back and say I'm doing a great job, that's a reward to my status. And we generally want the reward. If things are steady and constant, and I know I can depend on what you're going to do, what the business is going to do, what things are going to look like tomorrow, that's certainty, that's the reward. But it's also really unsettling when we're constantly being sold. They're talking about the next merger. I'm not sure if I'm going to keep my job. Autonomy, and I have to tell you, for me, this is a really big one because I'm one of those folks, and you may maybe one of them as well. I think I'm pretty decent at what I do, and I like to be able to do it and not have people micromanage everything that I do. And as a safety professional, again, safety professionals, again, I can't see the the chat right now, but we might be having some comments about this one. But sometimes we get brought in as a safety professional and then told, oh, you have to do this and you have to do that. And people are watching everything that you do all the time, trying to tell you how to do it when you hired me to do it. So that is a threat to our autonomy. And on the other hand, being given the responsibility that says, look, what we're looking for, here are these clear outcomes we want you to be involved in, and allowing you to do that really feels nice. Relatedness, and we were having the conversation earlier about the importance of community. Can I be in a community where I feel a part, where I belong? I feel like that I can make a contribution and I can get something back out of it myself. Or do I always feel like the odd person out? When I'm talking about safety and wearing seatbelts, people are rolling their eyes and talking about, here comes that safety person again. And then ultimately, fairness. Is it all about the bottom line? Again, I was hired to be the safety person, but I don't have a budget. I don't have a permanent office. I'm living out of my truck or out of my van. That doesn't seem to be fair when I look over at the superintendent or the operational person who is getting people injured regularly and breaking things and losing things, but they seem to get the budget and the support and the accolades from the business. Again, I'm not suggesting that either or should be the option, but they're both important. Why bring people into an organization when they don't actually have a contribution to make, and we should all get fair rewards from our contributions? So these psychosocial hazards, again, perception or experience, they can come from multiple sources. But there are three major sources where you're going to find psychosocial hazards existing. One is the work environment, the equipment and the tasks. The equipment, the environment, the workplace itself can be a psychosocial hazard to some. I'm not suggesting it's a psychosocial hazard to all. Because when the CEO walks through and sees, oh, look at our great business, and we've got things going on, and we're producing. But then when the worker walks through, and they may see something a little bit different. And again, not suggesting that either is right or wrong. Or again, the worker may think, oh, this is great, we're doing a wonderful job. But in the C-suite, they're going, well, that's not really working for us. And often the reason why there's such a difference is there's not enough communication between both levels of the organization or all levels of the organization to determine what the environment actually should be. Another source of psychosocial hazards is how the work is organized. The roles and expectations. And again, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I certainly have, where you get hired with a job description. And Scott mentioned that my graduate degree is in HR. So I know how to write a job description. I know how they should be put together. And I've also been in circumstances, I've had people tell me, well, we don't do job descriptions here. Well, how in the world are we going to have this thing accountable to what? When I filled out the job application and looked at what was advertised, you said it was going to be XYZ. And now I get here and it's PQZ2. It's something totally different. And it's okay that we've changed. The challenge is you didn't tell me you were changing. And now I'm being held to some sort of standard that I'm not aware of. How your work is organized can in and of itself be a psychosocial hazard. There are folks who are stressed out at work today, not because they can't do the work, but because they've been given way too much of it. So for some people, working remotely is very, very difficult because they really need to be around others. There are other folks who love being able to work remotely. And I'm not suggesting, again, that either is right or wrong. The question is, does that present a psychosocial hazard to the person who's being exposed to it? And there are also social factors at work. The other people, the other human beings that we get to interact with can at times create some real challenges for us. They can be because we're not all the same. And again, not suggesting that one is better or worse than the other, but we're very different. We have different life experiences. We have different things we've been taught and trained and different values. And these things affect how we perform in the workplace and in our communities. So these social factors, as we're talking about, where some of them can be perceived as a psychosocial hazard in and of themselves. And the one that we know the most about has to do with bullying, harassment, discrimination. And again, I had a video and we're going to move on from that one, but bullying, harassment, mistreatment at work, all of those are psychosocial hazards in and of themselves. And this is actually how I got really most interested in studying psychosocial hazard mitigation, is understanding or getting into some discussions that I had while working with the International Association of Fire Chiefs. As a matter of fact, we had a group that was set up to look at bullying, harassment, and violence prevention. Bullying, hazing, harassment, they're psychosocial hazards. We know, again, we know a lot about them, but they're psychosocial hazards in and of themselves that often cause people to come to work and do very dastardly things. Sometimes, exact violence on their coworkers through, bring a gun to work. These things didn't just pop up one day. They've been brewing in the background. And again, a hazard is really, really, really important when I'm vulnerable to it. And it's really important when those circles start to overlap. That's when it really starts to get our attention. And I'm going to suggest that psychosocial hazards, that everyone is vulnerable to them. You may not be vulnerable to a chemical hazard because you work in a call center. You might not be vulnerable to a psychosocial hazard because you're an entrepreneur. But we are all vulnerable to psychosocial hazards because it's about a perception or experience of our own. Now, again, I also have to say that this vulnerability is also based on the severity, frequency, and duration of our exposure as well. So I can take a lot of work. I can take this really heavy workload for a period of time. But if that goes on for months and months and months at a time, that could be a challenge. I can deal with, a customer, a client, a coworker who's they're kind of off today. They're having difficulty. They're expressing themselves in a way that's, it might be a little off-putting, but you kind of understand that they're just having a bad day. But when that goes on and on and on, and particularly when that comes from a person who should know better because they're supposed to be a leader, that becomes a little bit more difficult. And there are some things that when it happens once is too many, because it's really too severe. I don't take kindly to being cursed at work. There's a difference between using a swear word as a kind of expression, but to direct it towards me, it's, some people don't necessarily see that as a compliment, and that might be a little bit much to them. So where the hazard and the vulnerability start to overlap, you end up with the potential for risk. And risk from a psychosocial perspective is the likelihood that exposure is going to create some sort of harm to me. It's going to affect my health. It's going to injure me in some way. And again, we don't tend to think about psychosocial hazards in this way, but we should. So if I came to work and I was exposed to a chemical hazard and I got a burn, we would treat it in a certain way. But when I come to work and I'm exposed to a psychosocial hazard and it damages me emotionally, why is that treated any differently? Hazards that I'm vulnerable to that create a tremendous amount of risk have the potential for harm, and psychosocial harm tends to be manifested for the most part through stress. And again, there was another conversation about stress even during this conference. Stress is not necessarily always a bad thing. There is some healthy stress, or what's called eustress. If you have played competitive sports, if you've ever been a speaker or a singer or had to perform in some way, the butterflies that you feel is a form of stress. That healthy eustress that gets you focused. Because as a matter of fact, there are folks who have real difficulty with being bored because there's no stress at all. There's nothing to get me stimulated, nothing to really get me going. And peak performance is probably someplace in the middle where I've got a little bit of something to keep me going. So again, it's okay that I have a little bit of, I have those deadlines I have to meet. I have that proposal I have to turn in. The challenge is when it becomes too much and it becomes unhealthy. And where that tipping point is, it depends really on the person. What do I perceive or what do I experience myself as it's too much for me? And can I share that with you? Can I let you know that, yeah, that's just a little much. I need you to slow down on that one. And what makes it worse is when you are able to speak up and say something, but nothing is done about it, and you find yourself with panic and anxiety and anger and even burnout. So psychological safety is an important concept, but that concept is not possible without the identification of the psychosocial hazards in the environment itself. It's as if we're going to talk about fire safety, but we're not going to remove the sources. So there's heat, fuel, oxygen, and the chemical reaction. If you don't remove one of those, you're going to get a fire, period. So we can't have psychological safety without the removal or the identification or the mitigation of the psychosocial hazards. And that's best addressed. It's best addressed through a psychological health and safety focus that is a part of our safety management system. Okay? They actually go to, I'm not talking about something brand new. I'm talking about something that is a part of what we already have. So this is my appeal to safety professionals. When we start talking about psychological safety and psychosocial hazard mitigation, don't think of this as something different. This is not yet a new program. This should be a part of your current safety management practices. And if you're looking for a place to start, the World Health Organization and the International Labor Organization have some guidance that's been around for a few years now that attempt to get people looking at mental health in the workplace. So again, there was a wonderful conversation yesterday about mental health at work. As a matter of fact, most of the discussion around psychological health and safety is being driven by mental health practitioners, psychologists, therapists, and such. I am not a mental health professional, certified in mental health first aid, so I know a little bit about it, but I'm not a therapist. But it's no different than the fact that I'm not a chemist either. I'm not an ergonomist either. So many of us as safety professionals, we consider ourselves safety generalists. We know a little bit about a lot of things, and we know when to identify a hazard. We know when to identify that hazard is having a significant impact on people and on our business and on our organization. And we know how to reach out for help when it gets a little bit above our pay grade or it's out of my depth. So it's important, and it's important to have credible sources to be able to get that information. Also, and again, I made a little bit of mention about this before, but thankfully the folks at the International Organization for Standardization, the ISO folks, have created ISO 45003. And of course, 45003, many of you are aware of ISO 45001. That's the standard relative to occupational safety and health. And this is basically a companion to that standard that came out in 2021. And it focuses specifically on psychological health and safety at work. It's a really important document. If you haven't had a chance to go through it, I'd certainly advise you to do so if you're interested in this topic. And that standard identifies 88 unique psychosocial hazards. And again, that's not an exhaustive list, but it is a list that could be used for folks who are looking for some way to measure in more objective ways whether or not they're making a difference from a psychological health and safety perspective. Here in the United States, for about a decade, NIOSH has had the total worker health approach. Total worker health is about getting people to look at the fact that safety and health is not just about what's going on at work. It's about what's going on in people's communities. It's about leadership. It's about healthy eating. It's about exercise. It's about all of these things. And as much as some might argue that, look, that's somebody else's problem. Some might suggest that, we want people to come to work and do work. it is not possible for people to separate themselves into two different people. So if I've got something going on at home, that comes to work with me. That means bringing my full self. And the fact that, I live in a food desert and can't get healthy things to eat is going to affect how I show up at work. So again, if we really are interested in the safety and health of people, we have to be considerate of all these things. We can't solve all of them. Again, Covey talked about the difference between your circle of influence and your circle of concern, but there are resources out there and connections that we can make even from the occupational safety and health profession to others that are going to help us create a psychologically healthy and safe environment. Our Surgeon General has been very vocal about the importance of focusing on the mental health and well-being of folks. A lot of this we heard as we're all experiencing the global pandemic. My view of the pandemic is that it didn't really change as many things as people want to suggest. I believe that it didn't change a lot, it just exposed a lot, because many of the businesses that failed were already on the margins. Many of the people who unfortunately even died, they were already on the margins. They were already sick. They were already dealing with some sort of health challenge. And the COVID-19 simply pushed them over the edge. So again, not to minimize the impact of something that kills and had such a great impact on us, but in many cases, those who were really strong already were able to fight their way through it, were able to get through it. And again, both are really, really important. But what many of us started to recognize is that we were paying attention to the wrong things. And we weren't paying attention to how people were feeling. People who were in isolation, who realized how important it was to be able to be around family, to have supportive people around them. So significant challenges that we're starting to recognize. And we also have a generation of people who are now coming into the workforce who have different kinds of challenges. They're not weak, they're different. They simply see things different. I have my youngest son, for example, he was actually 18 years old, I should say, when the economic downturn occurred. And people in his generation, that's what they've seen. They find it's difficult for them to understand how it's challenging to find a job with a good wage, and it's challenging to be able to start a family, and it's challenging. So again, these are things that are going on. They're not bad people. They simply see a different world than people from my generation who were told a whole nother set of things that played out simply differently. Again, a psychosocial hazard is perceived or experienced as a threat. And these psychosocial hazards can affect people's mental health. So, and again, as we come to a conclusion, so we can probably have a little bit of discussion about some of the questions that may be there. But as a safety professional, my goal is to be able to identify psychosocial hazards, just like I'm able to identify other hazards in the workplace, to assess how vulnerable are we to this hazard. If we're not vulnerable to it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to pay a lot of attention and invest a lot of time in something that doesn't really affect us. But if we are affected, if we are vulnerable to the extent that we believe that there's the potential for harm, how do we mitigate? How do we address that hazard? And again, coming from, talked a little bit about my fire rescue background, you cannot eliminate seeing, dead people and seeing burned bodies and seeing chemicals released. That is the job. Being in a call center, you're going to get people who are going to call and going to be angry and irate and upset. Working in a mine, there are some inherent hazards associated with that work. But as if the employer is going to expose you to that hazard, do they not have a responsibility to mitigate that hazard to the extent that's necessary? And my view is that often we're a little Pollyanna about these hazards, and we just don't tell people what it really is. That even though our intent is to make sure that you don't get injured, these are the hazards that you're going to be exposed to. So when I started as a firefighter, I was told a lot about how to, take hose off a truck and how to extend ladders and, how to search for people who might be in a burning building. What I was not told as much about was the emotional impact of seeing a dead person. I saw my first dead person at 21 years old. I saw my first colleague die on the job at 22 years old. I was at an incident where one of a colleague died and I was 26 years old. These were the conversations that we were not having at the time. We've had them later, but what about that? And we're, in all industry, we're having a better conversation now about this is a hazard. It happens sometimes. And if people are going to be exposed to it, we should be having a conversation about how to mitigate that hazard. So in conclusion, psychological safety is an important concept. It's important that we think about it and try to do what's necessary to create psychological safety, but we're not going to be able to do that unless we're able to identify, assess, and mitigate the psychosocial hazards that people are being exposed to all of the time. And in order to do that in a systematic way, we're going to need a focus on psychological health and safety as a component of our safety management system.